Talks are starting soon. Please take your seat. Talks are starting soon. Thank you.
What? It has been a stressful day, and until the EPAM party, there's quite some time to go. No, I'm gonna wait until the party. And you guys also should join the party. Right there. So, EPAM is gonna treat us well today with some tequila, maybe whiskey, lots of beer, good DJs, live music, all that you want. Okay, I'm gonna... Want some? No? What are you guys sleepy? Come on. We still have a couple of talks to go until the party. All right. So, we continue our discussions about the human failures or system failures, but now we're going to concentrate on the human ones. So, it's rather a hyped topic these days. Go fast, break things, fail often, learn on it. But there are some mistakes that could be actually avoided. So our next speaker will tell us about all of those mistakes and what you should know about them and how to avoid them. Please say hi to Stefan Tilkov.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So yes, I'm going to talk about human failure. I will be talking about my personal failures to make you feel a little better about yourself. Because of course, none of you will ever have done anything like the things I'm going to talk about, right? I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about all those other people who make those mistakes, right? Because you folks would never do any of that. So I'll be talking about software architects and some of the failures that they run into. Originally, or alternatively, I had the title diseases you should know about. But then I thought this is a little, maybe this would bring the whole crowd down even quicker. So I thought I'd talk about failure as opposed to diseases. And then I thought, well, but disease is probably what it feels like to most of you when you do it. So I put in the alternative title as well. And if we talk about diseases, it makes sense to look at what it actually is. We're talking about how that might apply to the things we're doing in our daily lives as software architects or as developers who are tasked with architectural tasks. So if you look at the definition of a disease, then that is something that is, as you expect, an illness, right? Some sort of tendency that can be observed by looking for certain symptoms, and that's an analogy I'm going to draw on quite a bit. It's also, in this obsolete use, a lack of ease and a sign of trouble, which I think is also true for many of the things I will be talking about. So view these as potential pathological conditions that you might or might not observe in other people. And the first one, and one of my favorite ones, is this one. It's what I like to call the overgeneralization drive. And I don't know whether any of you have experienced that at any point in time, but it's observable when you notice that people see commonality in everything, everywhere. And they look for ways to solve problems once, because then our lives are going to be so much easier. Now, I personally went through a number of phases, and tell me whether you recognize yourself in some of that. When a young developer finishes school and starts developing things, they're typically enthusiastic, right? Because this is finally the time where they get to prove their skills to the outside world. Right? This stuff is cool. I spent so much time learning about all those fantastic technologies, all those methodologies, all those programming languages and patterns, and now I can finally put them to good use. Right? So you start your job somewhere at a bank or a software development shop or wherever, and you find out that what you do day in, day out looks a bit like this. And then you notice that this is actually pretty boring. And then you notice that maybe real people have boring problems. Now, that might turn into a problem because that is not what you signed up for, right? And so you become a disillusioned developer. And you're really unhappy about your life. Maybe you made the wrong life choices. Maybe you should have, studied economics or something like that, but that sounded way more boring back then. But then you discover something. You look at this and you squint a bit. And you see, wow, I'm onto something here. Actually, this is something a little more abstract. I can actually solve this problem. If I solve this particular problem once with a generic solution, then everything's going to be cool again, right? Because my life is going to be so much better. And that's when you turn into the enthusiastic architect, which is a very, very critical phase in your life, right? If you're a developer, this is where you can do the worst things to other people and systems around you, and you can really ruin people's lives and make them miserable. So we have a whole set of things to counter that particular set of symptoms, right? You have things like keep it simple and stupid, keep it simple, stupid. You ain't gonna need it. Don't invent something now that you may or may not need in the future because there's a high likelihood you won't, right? As happens with almost all of those very cool solutions. If it's cool, then that's a bad sign. We have the whole lean movement, which suggests that you maybe gather some data on whether that thing you're thinking about is actually a good idea, right? So you start with a little experiment, and once you notice that it's actually being adopted, then you do that more often. We have this whole concept of a minimal viable product, right? Something that you can try out in that particular regard would be something that solves the specific case first. We have this focus on stories that deliver user value, and those are all very good things. If you want to view them negatively, you could say you're now in the disillusion architect phase, right? Where you notice that all those cool things that you looked at in the past maybe aren't that great of an idea. There's a very old but still very good blog post by Joel Spolsky that talks about architecture astronauts. It's sort of the same idea, right? It's like when you talk to people who are so far away in space, they have no real connection to the real world anymore. You have discussions with them that are intellectually very, very satisfying and challenging and also completely pointless, right? Because they solve a problem that nobody actually had. So hopefully at one point in time you turn into what I like to call the wise architect. And the wise architect has a very good strategy. Whatever the question is, there's just one answer, right? Which is also the standard consultant answer, right? There's no such thing as something that matches every particular set of circumstances. So you have to look at the actual problem and then make an actual decision and select a solution that matches this particular set of circumstances. Now, related to this disease that I still observe quite a bit in my environment, is one that I like to call domain allergy. It's slightly related. It's related to the fact that many people would really, really like to build operating systems, or maybe cloud platforms these days. It used to be operating systems or databases in my day, and now it's probably some cloud monitoring solution, right? The domain itself is sort of a nuisance, right? You happen to work at a bank, but you didn't really want to look at the bank's use cases. You wanted to look at something that's technically challenging, right? So don't waste your time with that stupid business domain stuff. And it's related to the generic thing, because what people end up building or believing is that what you need is something like this. It's what I like to call the generic thing machine. It's this magical solution that can manage everything. And I've seen them in many forms. It's when you have something that actually doesn't do anything specific and it's related to this generic thing, but it also has this idea that the actual domain logic will just be a matter of configuration, right? Once you have this perfect thing, then you'll be very quick and you can just configure something. So it's 80% of the functionality and built into this generic machine, and then 20% will be very easy to do on top. But the problem, of course, as the old joke goes, is that those 20% will actually take you a lot of time. Now, that is just part of the problem. To me, the more important part of the problem is that there's now this thing standing between you, the developer or the architect, and the actual customer or stakeholder or end user, right? They don't care for your thing, right? They don't care whether you use Kubernetes on AWS or if you use something on Azure, or whether Google's your choice, or whether you prefer a NoSQL database to an RDBS. All of those things don't matter at all to somebody who actually wants to use a usable piece of software, right? So very often we waste a lot of time with this generic thing. I've been in projects where there were months spent on deciding which platform to use or build, or which ESB, or it used to be application service, and these days it's cloud platforms and schedulers and whatever, right? This is not something that delivers value to actual end users. And sometimes I have a feeling that it's pretty good if you have something that takes these choices away, that sort of makes these choices for you, right? It used to be the case in the Microsoft world. I think they're long past that. But there used to be a day when, if you picked the Microsoft stack, everything was just set up in a certain way, and there was the one way you used it. It used to be, and still is to a certain degree true for Ruby on Rails. It's also true for commercial off-the-shelf software, where a piece of software may just not give you the freedom to debate a lot of things, right? So you may be forced to use some crappy environment. I'm not saying any of these is. You may be forced to use some environment that you don't like, with a very restricted environment, but it also keeps you from discussing the structure of the directories in your build system for 6 weeks, right? You just start delivering value quicker. Now, I've talked about the dangers of overgeneralizing, right? Of building generic things too early, but of course, there is also the opposite thing. And that is that you really, really think you need something absolutely special for this particular set of circumstances, right? If you believe that your problem is so specific that nobody could possibly ever have thought about it, then you're sort of on the other side of this problem space, right? So there's an old anecdote that I love and that you may have heard me present before, which is this little problem here. If you look at it, it's a pretty simple programming problem. It's something that you could maybe that might be assigned to you as a class project or something like that, right? You read a file, it has some words in it, and you count the frequency of those words, and then you print a list of the most frequent words, right? That's sort of a pretty normal kind of assignment for a student, maybe. And these two people who really were not student at that point in time took this challenge and tried to find a good way of doing that. Now, Donald Knuth, that's the person you have those awesome books on your shelf that you never read, right? So Donald Knuth is probably the best computer scientist the world has ever known, probably will be for a while. And he, of course, solved this problem by inventing a number of algorithms and data structures on the fly and writing a 10-page literal Pascal program that was a thing and still is a thing of beauty, right? It's fantastic. It's like literature. It's mind-blowingly great. And this other person solved the problem like this. And you may notice that this is the actual program, which has as many lines as the description of the program on the left side. Now, of course, this person on the right, I can explain it, of course. This is right. This translates all the uppercase letters to lowercase letters, and then first it puts in line breaks, and then it translates uppercase to lowercase letters, and it sorts the stuff. It counts it using unique it sorts it in reverse numerical order, and then it prints it out in a nice way. And that's, of course, all done using standard Unix commands. Of course, Doug McIlroy is not anybody. This is the actual person who invented that pipe thing, right? So the message here is that sometimes you can just compose generic things, usable things, standard things to build something very, very quickly as opposed to building a very, very specific solution. Now, what inhibits us from doing this is believing that we need a perfect match. It's our search for perfection, right? We want to have the absolute perfect thing that matches what we're doing right now. We're not willing to sacrifice anything. But sometimes that's the wrong approach, right? So between those things, between this generalization, overgeneralization that I talked about, and the overly specific approach, of course, the common ground is in the middle, and again, it depends. Standard answer, we've been through that. Okay. So moving forward, something that I see very, very often is an attraction to complexity. It's as if we want to have stuff that's hard, right? We're so smart. We don't really want to do any of those simple things, right? Simple things are for other people, which is really a sad view of the world. And this is probably the one where I get the most negative, because I'm really not comfortable with people seeing this. All the others have sort of a good and a bad side. This, I think, mostly has bad sides, because there are benefits of complexity, but I'm not really serious about any of them, right? So maybe challenging work, I know that work should be challenging, but we shouldn't make it more challenging than it already is. We should look for the actual challenges that deliver, or that keep us from delivering value, and not invent challenges so that we have something fun to waste time with, right? It may be a new and interesting experience, which I also like, so maybe look for interesting challenges out there, but don't just invent them because that's the only reason for doing that. Self-esteem related to that, wanting to be part of a community is also a very common and also a very bad reason. I think you just want to apply this solution because you think the other people who apply this solution are kind of cool, and you want to be part of the cool kids. I don't really think that's a good idea. You also may want to create a barrier of entry, make it hard for others to do your job, also not a very good idea. Because while it may seem as if this creates job security, in the end, you might hurt your employer, you might hurt your organization. So those are all not good reasons for doing any of this. So I think complexity is our number one enemy. We should try to get rid of complexity where we can, and sometimes you can't, because sometimes things are complex, right? But then there's a good reason for addressing complexity. There's enough complexity in the world, we really don't need to invent any of our own. And now the next one, to me, is sort of a very, very German one. So I'm German, and I don't know about Hungary, but in Germany, it's very, very common to take a long, long time to make sure you really, really arrive at the right decision. It's got to be the perfect decision. So that leads to this, right? Sometimes it takes longer to evaluate something than to actually do it, or than it would have taken if we'd actually decided to do it, instead of talking about what it would be like if we did it one day. So my number one thing of this is the vendor selection process. And again, I don't think any of you work in organizations where something like this could possibly happen, but I've seen that occasionally, and this works like this, right? You have some tool or some platform or some vendor to choose. These days, this is probably a cloud vendor, right? So you run around, or maybe it's a piece of commercial off-the-shelf software even. Doesn't really matter. You go around and collect requirements in the worst possible way, which is you have your laptop or maybe a piece of paper, and you walk around and you ask everyone, and everyone tells you all of their wishes, everything they ever considered a possible thing that might be useful someday, and you end up with this list of like 2,500 requirements. And then you do some market research, right? This, of course, this takes a while, but luckily we have a process for that. We've done it before, so there's a process on how to do this. We conduct some market research, and then we come up with a list of vendors that we want to get involved in this whole thing. We send out a questionnaire to them, and then we evaluate the responses. And then we decide to maybe create a short list, just pick 3 of them and do a proof of concept kind of project with them. And then we evaluate the results, and then we recommend the whole thing. By now, we were like half a year in, and then our CEO decides to pick somebody else. Now, again, I'm not saying this has happened to any of you, but it's a pretty common thing. If we'd started in week 0 to just do it, with the risk that maybe we'd have to throw it away after 6 weeks, then we'd still have been able to build, what, 4 or 5 of those things in the same amount of time. And this analysis paralysis thing really drives me crazy, not as much as the complexity thing, but I really hate it if this happens. Sometimes you just need to do something. Okay, so let's move on. Innovation addiction. That is something that I find fascinating and that I observe in really, really smart and innovative people. Because what they like to do, and again, there may be some of you in the audience, I don't know, what they like to do is they like to play with stuff, right? They like to try out new things. And that's a good thing. I think you should try out new things. It's really, really boring to not do that. You should look for interesting new technologies, interesting new products. You should take a look at them and you should play around with them. The problem, though, is that if your main motivation is this playing around, then things become less fun during the course of a project, right? Because there's a time for playing around and there's a time for just, sticking with the stuff that you have and learning how to use it correctly and then maybe just build something as opposed to looking for the next thing. And it's sort of related to this fashion trend in our industry. I like to call it conference-driven architecture because I think that's something that is a nice quote to use at a conference. It also is something that you can see happening in actual real life, right? People go to a conference, and obviously there are some trends at the moment, some things that are being discussed. Let's take some arbitrary example. Let's take, I don't know, microservices, which is something that I like a lot. I like microservices. I'm a big fan of microservices. But if your only reason to use microservices is because you sort of feel that's the thing to do these days, then that's not a good reason, right? So don't use that as an excuse. I love this post by Dan McKinley. It's called "Choose Boring Technology." And for some people, that is the best possible advice, right? Choose something that is boring. Because for people who never choose something boring, this can sort of bring them back to the idea that it might make sense to use something that's mature and proven and has been used a lot. Now, of course, again, this is one of those things where, depending on who you talk to, and depending on where you are on that scale, you might end up having a very, very different view on this. So I have another anecdote for this. One of my colleagues, Gernot Starke, did a conference talk at a conference I was at as well. And in his talk, he said, stop looking at Google, stop looking at Facebook. Stop looking at Amazon and Twitter. You are not Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Twitter, unless you are, but most of you are not, right? Stop looking at those people for inspiration. Stop looking at new fancy technology, NoSQL databases, and that was new back then, it was a long time ago. So whatever is new these days, I don't know. What's the single page app framework of the week? I don't know. Whatever it is that you think is important. And instead, focus on learning the basics. Focus on learning how your database works. Focus on learning how to use SQL correctly, because that's going to deliver more value than looking at them. And that was a very good talk, and it resonated well with the audience. And then that exact same audience stayed in the room, and I came on, and I said, look at Google, look at Facebook, look at Twitter. Stop looking at Oracle or IBM for inspiration. Sorry, IBM, right? The problem here, of course, is that depending on who you talk to, some people really need to be reminded that there is a world outside your standard vendor. And other people need to be reminded that not everything that's done by Google is great automatically, right? So you have to sort of find a way between those things. And a good approach suggested in this post is this idea of an innovation token. That is the idea that you limit yourself, right? Like you say, in this particular project that I'm starting now, I'm allowed to do 2 things differently. So I can try out maybe going to the cloud for the first time and using a different persistency strategy, but I can't also decide to do the UI a completely different way or to adopt microservices. Just so you can spend 2 coins, but that's about it. And that's, I think, an interesting mental model for limiting yourselves to a reasonable amount of complexity within your projects. Okay, let's move on. This is one of my favorites because I think it's the root of many really bad architectures in practice. And that's this fixation on something that you already know, which leads you to tunnel something through another solution. Now that's just for the proc people in the audience. Let's go over this. The idea is that you look at something that's new. Let's say you pick up a new sort of framework, a new sort of library, and it's really very different from everything that you've done in the past. But that's a problem, because the thing you've done in the past is something that you know very well. It's also obviously what works, right? Because this newfangled stuff, it may be new, but it still does things possibly different or differently from what you've done in the past. So you might end up trying to force the old paradigm, the old model, the old way of doing things onto this new thing. And we can observe that in a whole number of things. Like, for example, when people try to do that thing called web services. Does anybody remember that? I'm not talking about, what we call normal these days, RESTful, HTTP, JSON over HTTP kinds of things. I'm talking about SOAP, WSDL, XML web services. That was a thing, right? Not all of you are too young to remember that. That was a phase where people tried to force an old model, the Corba model, the Corba RPC model, onto a changing environment, the web. And let's say it didn't work out too well. And we can see the same thing over and over again. People try to build desktop apps, except they run in the browser now. People invent and reinvent the same things they used in the past, always again and again using some new technology. And there's a related thing, which is then that something is done by somebody, so we'll just have to do it because it's these people who do it, right? It's like it may not even be us who are doing this, it's others who are doing the same thing. And now, why am I mentioning this here? Often this is a sort of a second-degree problem. It's not you who's doing the tunneling, it's somebody else who does. Let's take an example. When the alternative databases came out first, or became popular again, people were looking for ways to use them, and some people decided, well, we just use our existing ORM model and just map that to this new technology, which is simply not a good idea. I mean, you're using this new thing because you want to have its new features. If you were happy with the existing features of the old thing, then you wouldn't have changed it. Sort of makes sense, right? So some other people typically make those choices. People give you something that promises to keep the change minimal. They deliver something that you think will allow you to keep your investment. And that is something that especially big companies like a lot. So if somebody comes to a big company and says, well, I can use all your COBOL programmers, they don't have to learn anything new, they can just do the same thing they've always done, and they'll magically deliver something that now runs on top of whatever OO language you fancy, and that's something that you should be skeptical of, but if you're a manager, you typically aren't, because it just sounds too good. Which again proves that if something sounds too good to be true, it often isn't true. But anyway, I digress. Let's move on to the next one. The next one is sort of, again, related or on the opposite end of something that I mentioned before. It's when you have something that you've invested a lot in, and that thing becomes sort of your standard hammer and everything looks like a nail. So you become attached to something that you automatically apply it whether it makes sense or not. It doesn't really matter, right? So you've become an expert in, let's pick something that nobody likes. I don't know, I'm not going to name company names. This is live streamed, right? So I won't do that. So let's just say there's a huge enterprise IT vendor who sells a BPM solution, and maybe that vendor is red or blue, take your pick. And then you become an expert using this particular BPM solution, and then you apply it to everything. And that leads to horrible systems where people implement things that could be a 20-line Python script using a clustered process engine environment as the solution, right? It's a risk we all face because we all like our expertise. We all like being experts in something, and it's a very good thing, and it's a very good feeling if people come to you and ask you for help and you can answer all of those things. It's pretty hard to say, well, I'll just throw that away. It's like a comedian throwing away all his existing jokes and starting fresh, right? It's always a risk, but it sort of sometimes needs to be done. Related to that is this exaggerated risk aversion, right? We're sticking to stuff, and sometimes the stuff we stick to is really, really horrible. I've seen things. Maybe you've experienced this. Maybe you've experienced this yourself. You come to a new environment, and somebody explains something to you, like, this is how we do things around here, right? So if you want to make that kind of change, this is how you do it. And then you look at it closely and shake your head in disbelief, because this can't possibly be true. It can't possibly be true that people have accepted this and think this is kind of okay. So you start arguing, and you start hitting walls, and you start discussing things with people, and then you sort of grows, no, that's the wrong way to phrase it. It doesn't grow on you. You sort of don't really care that much anymore. And after a while, that's just the way you do things. And then this new person comes along, and you explain to them that this is just the way things work, and they look at you in disbelief. So these things happen for years. You can see people who have lived with, my favorite example, a build where the build of the system took 26 hours. And that's kind of a normal thing. That people accept those kinds of things unless somebody shakes them. So maybe you should be the one doing the shaking occasionally. And this is related to one of my favorite talks I'm going to mention pretty soon. This confusion or confusing of easy with simple, right? Sometimes what's easy to do right now is what's actually the hard thing. What's actually riddled with complexity. The hard thing is often to do the simple thing. So again, an example from this web services world, maybe some of you experienced that, is when you're in your IDE and you have a class and you hit the right mouse button and say generate and deploy web service, and then something happens and lots of code gets generated and some runtime environment gets fired up and something gets deployed there and some messages are, you have no idea what you're doing, but it was very easy to create that setup, to create that system. So simple and easy, complex and hard are really things that you need to contrast and talk about for a while to find out where you want to spend your energy. And there's a fantastic talk by Rich Hickey, the inventor of Clojure, about this whole thing. It's related to language design, of course, but that's not really the essential point here, although Clojure is a fantastic language. But the talk is worth watching because he addresses this particular topic very, very nicely and talks a lot about how simplicity should be something to strive for and how that might mean that you have to do something that is hard right now. A little plug for my second talk. I have a talk immediately after this one, which is why I'm going to run away once we're done with this to another place, the blue tent or something. And then I'm going to talk about even more human things. And one of the things here is that this simple and easy, complex and hard thing is also something that's very human in general, right? It's related to our feelings and to our self-esteem and self-worth, that sometimes playing with this complex stuff gives us satisfaction that is a good reason. And it's really hard to convince people that something else is better, and this might turn into something that you will find hard with your colleagues. We all view our managers as the bad people, right? It's always our managers who keep us from doing reasonable things. It's never our peers, it's never ourselves. But sometimes it's ourselves and our peers who create complexity and who make things unnecessarily hard. And if you want your peers, your colleagues to accept that you have a harder work, that you need to work more because the end result is going to be simpler, that might be a tough sell, right? You might have to need some better arguments for that. This is another one, and the last one in my list, actually. And I like to call it impact dissonance. This is really something related to the architect's role. This is particularly prevalent in people who actually are architects as a role and have that on their business card somewhere, right? It's related to being too detached from the actual system. And so it's related to this megalomania, because sometimes you think that you're so important that everybody, absolutely everybody, has to consult with you first before you do anything reasonable and meaningful. And that is, I think, related to the role of the architect in general. So I'm not a big fan of having architects or having an architect as an explicit role. I think we have architectural work very often, but I admit that sometimes in bigger projects and bigger organizations, you end up with people who only fulfill things in that role, so they might end up being actual architects. So what architects want to do is similar to, I think, everybody. They want to do good things. So this is maybe the view an architect the view architects have of themselves, right? You want to be involved with the important things. I think if you adopt this architect role, then you care about stuff. You want to be influential. You want to be impactful, right? So you want to shape strategy of your organization or of the company or of the system you're playing with. You want to make important decisions about those things. You don't want to make every decision, but you want to make or be involved with the important ones. You want to explore new stuff. Right? That's what drew you into this place. Architects typically are people who like to play around. They used to be the fancy developers who always knew something new and who always fought to be able to go to conferences, right? That's what gave them motivation. And they also want to mentor developers. They want to develop themselves, occasionally at least, but they also want to be the partner of the developer in helping them fulfill their role. Now the problem is that these views are not necessarily shared by other people around those architects, right? So people think architects slow down development. They're an impediment. The architects are impediments. So actually somebody should remove them. They slow down development, they continuously pick the wrong tools. I mean, they always make the wrong choice, like in every single occasion. And they define those annoying rules that you have to adhere to, even though you know that if you didn't adhere to them, you'd be much more productive, right? You could do something that would be way more in line with the actual requirements of this particular situation you're in. Most annoyingly, architects never listen to developers, right? They think there's something better. So developers tell them your rule doesn't work, and they say, well, you don't apply it correctly. You just have to follow it correctly, and then everything will be good. Now, this is just a different way to phrase this wonderful saying from Ted Newart, which I like a lot. Architect is Latin for can't code anymore. I don't necessarily agree with that, right? I think architects very often are no longer on a critical path and no longer actively develop important parts of the system anymore because they're busy with other stuff. At least that's what they like to think. But there's a certain truth that after a while, if you've been an architect for like a decade and the last time you wrote actual production code is like a decade in the past, then maybe you should reconsider whether that's an actually very good idea. Or you can become a conference speaker, that's fine as well. So what architects actually do, I think, is a little different. Or what I could have titled this slide, what architects actually should do. So I think the most important thing for architects is to be salespeople. And that seems a little crazy, right? Didn't you go into this IT developer technical thing because you wanted to avoid marketing and sales? Because that's not for real people, not for smart people, right? That's what your failing classmate took as their major? No, you were supposed to be the smart, well, no, that's wrong. Actually, I'm starting to appreciate this more and more the older I get, or if you want to, the less I know about actually technology. But I think that actually being able to convince people that your ideas are good ideas is an absolutely essential skill. It begins with it being able to communicate them correctly, to write about them, to present them, to draw diagrams that people can understand, to maybe explain things in a different way if people don't get it the first time. That is something that you have to do, communicate. And you have to defend your architecture against well-meant criticism, because people are going to tell you, well, that's not we could do it this way because then it would be better. And the interesting thing is, they might be right. You may be wrong. Maybe you picked the wrong choice, and it would be a very good thing to listen to this particular developer on how to do things better, and it might improve things. So having that discussion and defending things in a positive way, not defending it against any criticism, that's not what I mean, is an important thing. You also will continuously have to fight to remain involved, because from this perspective, the one I had before this year, I think everybody would agree that the best thing that can happen is to let the architect sit in their room somewhere and draw diagrams and put them on the wall, and nobody ever looks at them except for a laugh, right? If you are this kind of architect, then that's rightfully what people want to do with you. So if you follow this advice, then you will actively try to be involved with actual meaningful decisions in real life. You will try to be part of actual projects that deliver value, and you will look how well your architectural decisions work in the small or in the large, depending on what kind of architect role it is that you have here. And you will do some technical stuff, because that's important. Maybe it's a little more than 5%, but if you want to become an architect in a larger organization at least, it's really, really hard to go to a 95% I code all day role, so the politics come into play way more than many of us like to believe. So I'm done through my 10 diseases, and I promised that I would say something about what to do about them, right? So this is sort of the miracle cure to all of those things that I mentioned before. In typical consultant manner, I don't have an answer, so here's one anyway, right? So the answer to me is a mixture of a lot of things. So this is my success formula, my attempt at a success formula for architects. I think a certain amount of actual rules and even dogma can be a good thing, particularly if you're an organization where there are very inexperienced people. And I like an approach where you have a very, very limited set of rules, as few of them as you can, but you stick to them and you defend them and you make sure that people understand why they're important and you actually enforce them somehow. Hopefully by convincing people that they're a good idea and not by threatening that they'll be fired if they don't follow them, but still, a little bit of that is fine. And you should stick to your own rules unless you change them because you've learned something new. Experience. You need to actually have some experience. I think it's pretty hard to, from university, become an architect by maybe going to a training course or something like that. So you actually have to have made a lot of mistakes, which is also one of the reasons I like to talk about mistakes. I think every mistake and every failure actually makes us a little bit better for the next project that we're doing. You have to be pragmatic. It's sort of a no-brainer, but I think it's really, really important related to all of the other things that I'm talking about. Right? Making pragmatic decisions and saying, well, this may not be perfect, but it's what delivers value now and what makes us more likely to succeed right now is a very good idea. You have to be flexible, and your systems have to be flexible. And a certain amount of that is okay. Despite, we have this pendulum that always goes to one or the other direction or other extreme. Sometimes I've seen agile projects that decided that architecture in general is a bad thing, which is a stupid thing to say because you can't avoid having an architecture. You just end up with one that you didn't want if you don't care about it. So, being on an agile project does not mean you're no longer allowed to think. Right? So you can think a little bit into the future, just not too much, and be pragmatic and think about the right amount of flexibility to build your systems and be flexible in your decisions. Minimalism, probably I should raise this a bit. I think this is a very important thing because all of the moving parts add to the complexity that you add to your system, and if you can get away with a minimal solution, that's often a good chance or increases the chances of your system being a success. Transit future needs, again, look at what others do, but don't exaggerate that. Try to find out new things. Go to conferences because conferences are great and you can learn from other people and you can ask them whether this really actually worked and you can maybe try it out. So experiments and proof of concepts are a very useful tool to actually get some real world experience early on with things where no one else has had the chance yet to build up a decade of experience. I've been in actual organizations where people made a critical, important choice of a vendor or a product or a tool and never installed it. They never even tried it once. They made the decision purely based on the marketing material provided to them, and that's not a recipe for success. Hands-on participation, I think, is a very important part to the degree that you can manage, right? So depending on the size of your organization, you may not be in that role, you may not have a chance, or it may actually end up being a bad idea. Every architect I know wants to, let me rephrase that. Every good architect I know wants to code. They all like coding, they would love to do that. But every smart architect I know has stopped doing that on the critical path. right? Because you end up being too focused on that particular thing to care about the important stuff around, right? So you have to maybe pair with people or find a good way to remain involved. And also have this last ingredient, or rather, I don't, right? So stay clear from the vendors because they're clearly not in your best interest. I hope that was useful, and that's all I have for now. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was really exciting, no? Let's have some questions. Do you have a couple of moments before you have to run?
Yes.
3 questions.
Okay.
Let's do it. What direction do you think architects should take to avoid getting extinct?
Well, to me, if it's the name that is becoming extinct, I'm fine with that. I mean, it's just a name, it's just a role, right? If we decide that architect is now a bad word, like SOA or so, that's, or maybe microservices 5 years from now, who knows? You know, if words become negative or have a negative connotation, then we should stop using them. So that's fine with me. I don't think architecture will disappear because that's just the sum of the important decisions about our systems, and somebody has to make that decision. Ideally, I'd love to be in a team where architectural decisions are made by the team as a whole. That's perfect. If the team can do that, then by all means go for it. Very often you have a team where people have different levels of experience, and naturally 2 or 3 of them will make more decisions than the others. Those might often end up those with the most experience, those who communicate best, those who sell their ideas best, who defend their ideas best, who know how to focus on the important stuff. You know, if those are just personality traits that in some then make those people architects without them calling themselves that, that's fine with me.
All right, thank you. What direction, or nope, in which of these diseases do you find yourself in?
All of them, 100% of them. At least I've had them in the past. I think I've got them under control. I'm sort of on good medication right now. But yes, these are all things, particularly the first one. Maybe you noticed the enthusiastic developer. That's my very personal story. I did that for so long. I feel so sorry for my first employers that I put this burden on them. But I learned from it, at least.
Learn on your mistakes, huh? How do you get rid of tunneled vision when assigned to a new project or in a new company or environment? Old habits die hard.
Yes, that's very true. I think you have to make a choice. I mean, it's a valid choice to say you just stick with one thing and you become an absolute expert in this one thing. You just run into a risk of this one thing becoming obsolete at one point in time. So maybe it's not a good idea. I prefer the approach where you occasionally really try to start again from scratch with something, well, not from scratch because you're still in the same industry and you can still rely on your experience, but I like challenging myself and trying something completely different. And I think that's the best way to stay relevant in this industry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.